Oh, gee, Rose, and today we're going to be talking about geometry, astronomy, and Platonic forms as ordering principles, on understanding forms like invisible guardrails in which things become themselves. I'm no expert on Plato. There are many scholars that have been debating the meaning of forms in the Republic for years and years, and I'm not going to tell you that what I'm about to say is necessarily what Plato intended or that it is correct. If it is a misreading, I hope it is at least a useful misreading, and I don't want to say that there's no truth to any of the other understandings of forms. But we all know about the idea of Platonic forms as, say, the perfect cup, the Platonic cup, which has this notion of being perfect and the greatest of all possible cups. And that's mostly what people think about when they think about Plato and the Platonic and the Philosopher King, the perfect individual, the perfect thinker, and stuff like that. Well, it's funny when you go back and read a great book that, one, the first thing you do is realize you need to read it 100 more times, that you're an idiot and that you missed a lot of the details and things like that. And what was really interesting to me on revisiting Book VII of the Republic, there was a section in Book VII that really had not stuck out to me before that I found really interesting. So he's laying out the whole educational program for the Philosopher King, Plato is, or Socrates. And he says something along the lines of, I can't conceive of any subject making the soul look upward except one concerned, which is invisible. If anyone attempts to learn something about sensible things, he never learns anything. Even if he studies lying on his back on the ground or floating on it in the sea, his soul is looking not up but down. So this is important because he's suggesting that forms are not simply a matter of looking up, that it's not a matter of directionality. And he's getting into a debate on, do we need to teach astronomy, which is the movement of planets? And, it would seem that Socrates or Plato, I'll just say Plato, he's kind of like, well, that's maybe better than other things. But what's interesting is he seems to be much more interested in geometry. And because he gives you this notion that if we can see it, it's not worth learning. What's worth learning is something that can be grasped by reason and thought, not by sight. So he really wants us to focus on the invisible. Well, that sounds very dualistic. That sounds very heavenly. That sounds a lot like theology. But if we think about the invisible like the orbit of a planet, where a planet is a visible thing, but it's moving in an orbit. And this seems to be why Plato likes math. He talks a lot about math. Math is special to him. But also geometry seems special to him, which we can associate with the movement of a planet in orbit. And it would seem that that is really what's interesting to him. That's really what matters. It's the orbit of a planet is invisible, and yet it is the necessary condition in which the planet moves. It's a description of how the planet moves. And yet, if you think about it, you actually don't learn about an orbit if you just looked at the planet. If you saw, say, the moon circling Earth, and all you did was look at it, just look at it, you would never see the orbit. In order to derive the existence of the orbit or to conclude about it, you have to think about what you're seeing. You have to think about a visible thing to get to an invisible thing, which would be the orbit. And the orbit is very real. This is not disembodied. This is not illusionary. The orbit is very real. So anyway, Plato has this part also in Book VII where he says something like, therefore calculation, geometry, and all the preliminary education required for dialectic must be offered to the future rulers in childhood, and not in the shape of compulsory learning either. So he's basically like, we need to convince them that calculation and geometry is fun, it's something you want to do, it's a form of play, and he's talking about in childhood. But he really is going to emphasize calculation and geometry so much. Both of these are invisible. You don't see the calculation inside someone of numbers. You can't see 2 + 2 = 4 in reality. You can't see it. If you see 2 apples come together with 2 more apples and make 4, you don't actually see 2 + 2 = 4. You just see phenomenon, more phenomenon. So in order to derive the calculation of 2 + 2 = 4, you have to move from the visible to the invisible, in the same way that you have to move from the planet to the orbit. And there's another section where Glaucon, I think it is Glaucon, he says something like, what did you mean when you said that astronomy must be learned in a different way from the way in which it is learned at present, if it is to be a useful subject for our purposes? So, Glaucon has suggested to Socrates that rulers should learn about the heavens And Socrates is kind of like, well, that I don't know about that, maybe. And there's allusions that people are learning about astrology, which is no good. But Socrates doesn't necessarily want to throw out astronomy, but he suggests that we need to learn about astronomy in a different way. And so Socrates goes, we should consider the decorations in the sky to be the most beautiful and most exact of visible things, seeing that that they're in the heavens, that they're very perfect. But we should use those perfect spheres as a model in the study of other things. If someone experienced in geometry were to come upon plans very carefully drawn and worked out by a great craftsman, he'd consider them to be very finely executed. But he'd think it ridiculous to examine them seriously in order to find the truth in them about the equal, the double, or any other ratio. Let's study astronomy by means of problems as we do geometry, and leave the things in the sky alone. So what he's getting at is that if you studied the planets, to marvel in their perfection, the spheres of the heavens, that's not good, because you're looking at sensible things. And in fact, it could be extremely tempting, precisely because they're perfect, according to them back then, that you would never want to look for the invisible things. So Socrates is suggesting, okay, well, if we study the planets in order to study the orbits, to derive invisible principles about the planets, that's good, that's fine. But it might be a little dangerous to look at the heavenly spheres because they're so beautiful. Maybe it'd just be better to focus on geometry. But if we were to derive geometry, orbits from the planets, that might be okay. That's at least how I interpreted that exchange. So Plato seems to be saying that movement of the heavens is too perfect to warrant serious study. If you're studying the movement of the stars, that's good, but there's also something almost too perfect about it. Which I find really interesting, because usually we associate Platonic forms with being perfect, and that's why Plato thinks we should study them. But it's almost like here he's suggesting that the orbits of planets are too simple to warrant serious study. We can indeed get some education from them because there are some invisible forms that the planets are following, and that's great. But it's almost like they're too perfect and they're too simple. So instead, Socrates wants us to think about instead, the forms of light cups, or the forms of cats, or the forms of tables. The way things stay constant in the middle of change, on Earth. Change, for Socrates, the way change occurs on Earth is not like it changes in heaven. And in heaven, it's too perfect and it's too simple. And since we don't live in heaven, or we don't live among the planets, learning about their orbits, their forms, is not going to necessarily help us on Earth. And again, the context of this entire discussion is the education of Philosopher Kings. So here's the main point so far. Forms, if education is about forms are like orbits, the orbits of stars, the tracks, the trajectories by which the planets move, that things move. Forms are the paths along which things formulate. They are the path by which things become themselves while staying themselves and becoming truer to themselves in the middle of change. Because in a sense, this chair that I'm sitting in, whatever it's going to be in the future, is in a sense truer than what it is right now, because now is always passing into the future, just like that. Now is kind of an illusion. It's not, and yet it is. Now, again, this doesn't necessarily mean the future chair is more important than the chair now, because the chair now is what I am sitting in, dang it. But there is a sense in which the future chair is going to be more true, or let's say more relevant, because the moment you are thinking, you're thinking about something not here, right? So it's kind of more aligned with the future. The thinking is always kind of toward the future, if you will. You're always directing it toward what is to come, even if you're trying to understand the chair that is in front of you right now. You cannot give your understanding that you gain in 5 minutes to your past self. So the future thinking is always kind of in service of who you're going to be or the world that you're going to be in. So there's something future-oriented about it, and thus something truer about it. Thus, what things become is in a way truer. Now, I don't want to push this language too hard or anything like that, but there's something about what things are becoming that's truer than what they are. And this is kind of also strange, because I do think we traditionally associate Plato with being, this kind of stable state, and that's fine. I think there's warrants to that interpretation. But there's reason here to think of what things are currently being is a trajectory, is a movement that entails a becoming. And you only know what a thing is right now in its being in so much as you know that formulating principle. So, for example, if a planet is currently being a planet, you really don't know everything there is to know about that planet or its full self or where it's going unless you know about its orbit. Thus, being has to be in service of the becoming of that being. You can't just isolate being. If you have an isolated being, if we follow this understanding, a planet that doesn't have an orbit is probably like dead or gone or no longer functioning if it's just stable. The planet has to keep moving in its orbit or it's going to become dysfunctional. So a stable being, even if there is a sense in which the word being is legitimate in the description of the planet to itself, it has to always be in the context of a becoming, or you lose both. Being always has to be in concert with becoming, or you don't have either becoming or being. So the study of the form of a chair is in fact an understanding of what the chair is in its being, but its being is always being formulated. There is a formulation that is occurring. The cup is always becoming its future self. It is always becoming. So when you study being and you're looking for the form, you are looking for becoming. So here, I think we might want to think. I think we've come to develop a habit of associating being and form. When being and form might need some distinctions, and it might not be so simple. Form and being might not be the same thing. It might be more so that form is being / becoming, where there's both a becoming and a being entailed in the word of form. And I also would argue that form might need to lose its kind of mystical sound to it. I try to argue in the paper Reconstruction that Aristotle may have easily associated form with, say, the form of the human being with DNA. That what Aristotle was positing from his observations of change is that there had to be some source of a stability in the middle of that change in order for human beings to continue being humans. And he may have easily said, DNA is it, once he learned about DNA. It's actually remarkable that Aristotle would posit the need of something like DNA that he referred to as the form, or, I mean, you get into the distinctions between form, substance, and essence, but to simplify the language here, Aristotle is positing the need of some constant form in order to explain how things stay themselves in the middle of change. So forms don't have to be these kind of mystical, strange things in the same way that with Plato here, we can understand form as being linked up with time quite a lot and becoming quite a lot. And we can think of form as, like I said with guardrails, we can think of in the same way that when a car's on a road and there are guardrails, the car is kind of stuck on the road. We don't know where it's going to. It could reverse on the road. It could, slam into the side of the guardrails, or it could stay straight ahead. But there's a certain parameters that are set in which the car can move, and it can't really go outside those parameters. In the same way, we can think of forms as the guardrails in which things develop and become themselves in their being. So a cup is itself as a cup, but in that, it is also becoming the cup that it will be in the future. In this way, we can't easily separate. We can't easily separate being and becoming. Becoming is always a coming of being. Become, come being. And so that separation, I think, has led to a lot of confusion. And I think if we think about forms as formulating principles, the principles according to which things form and formulate as themselves, like the orbit of a planet, then it becomes easier to understand what Plato is getting at. And it also becomes easier to understand why he has this emphasis on the invisible. It is not because the invisible is necessarily a heavenly realm. Now, look, obviously in Plato there are heavenly realms. There are the suggestions of a heavenly realm of pure being and things like that. I understand those dialogues and stories and those interpretations. But if we want to have a different understanding of forms, I suppose, from the traditional take on the Platonic, then I think understanding forms as formulating principles of things becoming more so themselves and yet staying themselves in the middle of change is useful. So I think based on Socrates' emphasis on the invisible, which are formulating principles, orbits, you don't see orbits but you see planets, then we can start to understand that when Socrates is emphasizing the invisible, it's not because he's emphasizing the some realm that has nothing to do with the physical realm. Instead, what he's emphasizing are the formulating principles according to which things become themselves. like the orbits that planets follow. So anyway, this has been OG Rose. For more, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, all these things, Anchor, and thank you so much for your time.